My name is Bill Marshall. I teach law at the University of North Carolina. Some of the subjects I teach include media law and First Amendment law and constitutional law.
Great. Well, one of the questions that has come up quite a bit with fake news, let's say some sort of news story that claims someone was doing something like Hillary Clinton's campaign committing voter fraud in Ohio, whether that is even legal and protected by the First Amendment. And what does the First Amendment, what does the law say about this?
Okay, first of all, what you need is in order to make it illegal, you need a statute. If there's no statute that covers that kind of issue, you don't have to worry about it. If there is a statute, then the question of whether or not that speech is protected by the First Amendment. In a recent case, the court in a case called United States versus Alvarez said that just a law that makes falsity illegal would probably not survive constitutional scrutiny. So what you need is sort of a directed law in order for it to survive. So I think a general law that said you can't lie in a campaign would probably be struck down. But if it was more directed, if it said something like you can't say that a polling place is on the corner of Hollywood and Vine when it's actually on the corner of Main Street and Elm Street, that could very well likely be punished, even though it's a form of fake news.
Okay. So in the recent election season, have you seen any stories or heard about any cases which kind of approach the limits of what's acceptable legally?
Well, I mean, there is if a story amounts to libel, in which case somebody's reputation is interfered with, then you can raise a libel claim. There are First Amendment protections there, but a libel claim can still succeed if you show that the person who issued the libel knew that they were saying something false or had reckless disregard of the falsity. So stories that actually libel somebody, harm their reputation, those could be subject to sanctions under the First Amendment.
Does libel actually protect public figures in the same way it might protect a private citizen?
No, it protects public. Public figures are less protected from libel. They have to show what I called a minute ago actual malice, meaning knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. If it's a non-public person, they only have to show that whoever's saying the libel about them acted negligently.
Okay.
So it's much more protected. The speech about public figures is much more protected, and speech about candidates in particular are much more protected.
It seems to be one of the problems with a lot of the fake news that's been in the headlines is no one actually knows who's writing these stories. Are there, some sort of generic news website, and we hear stories that are coming out of Eastern Europe or, all sorts of different places. Does that make things more complicated legally?
Well, there are some cases out there that suggest that anonymous speech is protected. And the reason why is because anonymous speech has been very important to our history. That pamphlets of people who otherwise might be subject to harassment or something that became known who wrote it is a part of our history. What we're seeing now with the development of the internet, much more of a danger coming from anonymous speech, because the problem with anonymous speech, as you know, is with anonymity, there is no accountability. So there is some suggestion that the court might reconsider whether or not it wants to provide as much protection to anonymous speech as it has. But right now, at least under existing precedent, anonymous speech is protected just as heavily as non-anonymous speech.
Does that protection of anonymous speech extend to, private information or classified information? I'm thinking of leaks and this.
Private anonymous speech is not protected if it's disclosing something that is legitimately protected as classified information. Mm-hmm. So when those leaks have taken place, if you find the leaker, they are subject to criminal sanction, even though the information might be important for the public and even though the information might be true. So anonymity is not going to protect them, but of course the investigators have to figure out who it is who's actually writing the story, and that can take some time and be very difficult to ascertain.
Right. When we look at the kind of broad landscape of fake news, I think on the one hand, there's obviously satirical websites like The Onion or the fake news stories on Saturday Night Live, Weekend Update. What does the law say about satire versus something that may be a little bit more malicious or misleading?
Yeah, I mean, the law is actually pretty clear on this. It's something, satire is fully protected, and there's a great case in which the court talks about this and it traces the history of things like editorial cartoons. But something that is not satire, and you can tell by the context of what it's supposed to be, and you have to do that, but something that presents itself as a legitimate story is not protected by the rules that protect satire. The way the court looks at it is the story in question giving us a verifiable assertion of fact? Is it really making a factual claim, or is it something that's hyperbole or exaggeration? And The Onion and Saturday Night Live are pretty clear that they fall in that latter category.
So I'm wondering about this this website. I think studies show it was the most circulated fake news story on Facebook prior to the election. It was hosted by a site that was abcnews.com.co. So it looked like the ABC logo, but the story was obviously a fake story about Obama signing a ban on the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools. Could ABC News sue for someone using their identity? Is the site, even though it doesn't say anywhere it's satire, is it protected?
Yeah, if somebody, I mean, there are trademark claims that can be brought, or copyright claims that can be brought by entities that have a property kinds of interest in that. So if I said to you now, Bill Marshall, CBS reporter, or something like that, for misrepresentation like that, or if I tried to claim some sort of CBS or ABC mantle, there are particular property kinds of protections. Mm-hmm. But those are less involved as to the truth or falsity of what I'm saying than it is my claiming or my trying to take a property right away from the entity in question.
Right. So if this ABC News fake site was actually stating, an actual news story, that's not the issue legally. It's that they were kind of misrepresenting themselves as ABC.
It's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Are there kind of legal implications surrounding fake news that you haven't seen people talk about?
Well, there's a broader issue here, if you don't mind. One of the
Sure.
great opinions in First Amendment jurisprudence is one by Justice Brandeis, in which he basically says the remedy for bad speech is more speech. But for that to work, you sort of need referees out there that can distinguish between what's true and what's false. And what we're seeing in our current milieu is there is no referee. Somebody said we're so democratic in our country that everybody believes that they're entitled to their own facts. And that's problematic because at some point this celebration of free speech undercuts what free speech is designed to achieve, which is to promote an informed electorate. So we're seeing a massive tension there. At the same time, and this is where the problem comes in from the other side, if we were to say government, you can go punish people who are issuing fake news, then you get the problem sometimes of the fox guarding the henhouse, because the news may very well be news that is critical of the government, and the government might be less sympathetic to stories that are about it as opposed to stories that are saying bad things about somebody else. So
what's the way forward in a situation like this?
I think we're struggling. I mean, I think we are struggling right now. I think that we are at that this election and the way our politicians are behaving and the breakdown into niche media where people who are looking at some media are not even speaking the same language as people who are talking to another media are really testing the very foundations of what the First Amendment was designed to achieve, the sort of this notion of an informed electorate, of a marketplace of ideas where truth will win out over falsity. I mean, we're living in a climate where people just want to have their beliefs confirmed by what they read rather than being exposed to something new. And this is happening on both sides of the political spectrum. It's called the echo chamber. And so I think that's really testing the foundations of our First Amendment theory.
Do you see any kind of court cases bubbling their way up through the system that are speaking to this challenge?
Well, the most recent one that spoke to this challenge was a case coming from Ohio, which dealt with the constitutionality of a statute they had there, which tried to regulate false campaign speech. And although the court didn't rule directly on that issue, they were very hostile to the constitutionality of that law. And the Alvarez case, which I referenced previously, seems to indicate that the court, at least at this point, is not friendly because on First Amendment grounds to laws that are trying to regulate the veracity of speech. So that's where things are going.
Right. So I guess in a kind of a lay person's terms, I mean, it's more of this kind of open market, anything goes.
It's more of the open market, anything goes. And we're seeing, I think that what Facebook just did, and I haven't looked at this as closely as I might in the last couple of days, which Facebook said it's going to take some measures to try to weed out fake news in a way that fake news doesn't have the algorithms or reinforcement that it's had so much. Maybe a step. We may be seeing private concerns worried about this enough to regulate, to try to kill some of this phenomenon. And the First Amendment does not apply to private organizations.
Right. You know, I hear this sometimes when people hear that Facebook is going to try to cut down on free speech, try to cut down on fake news, or YouTube change the algorithms of which videos are in your queue, that people claim, that's censorship. But I guess your point is, private companies can do a lot more than the government here.
Right. Yeah, I hear this all the time. When the NFL sanctions somebody because of what they said, you hear the press say that's violation of freedom of speech. No, it's not, because freedom of speech only applies against the government. It doesn't apply against private entities.
Is there any point where a private entity becomes so public where it does seem to matter? I'm thinking like a Google or Facebook.
You're getting into a very, very sophisticated area of First Amendment law. There are a few cases out there, okay, dealing with company towns, what used to be called company towns in working class areas surrounding factories, in which the court held that those streets, even though they were owned by a private company, were the equivalent to the state. Mm-hmm. So there is some case law out there. But in later cases, the court has held that private shopping centers are private. And though that's where everybody congregates, you don't have a First Amendment right to go there too. So the law is mixed. There is certainly a very powerful argument that entities such as Google have amassed so much power and have taken over such a role that the First Amendment should apply to them. But that's still a couple steps away in the line.
Right. And I know a lot of the focus is on the First Amendment and freedom of press, freedom of speech. Do you see anything else? Are there any other kind of anything else in the Bill of Rights that comes into play when we talk about fake news or fabricated news? Are there any other kind of legal things to consider beyond the First Amendment?
I think the First Amendment, nothing comes to mind offhand. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah. But
I think it's the First Amendment that's where all the action is going to be on this particular kind of thing. And then it's with ourselves too. I mean, it's actually Walt Kelly once said in the famous, we have met the enemy and they are us. I mean, if we are not doing our own work to check and see what we like, there might be a story that confirms everything we ever believed about the Trump administration or the Obama administration, but we might take a pause for a moment and check and see how real that is and where the source is coming from, even if we like what that story says. But we don't be having much of that in our culture right now.
Right. Do you have any tips for your law students, or tips that could apply to the media or the public in general when they consume information?
I sure do. And that is, read sites that are not ideologically friendly to where you are, no matter how painful that might be. Go on and read the sites and see what's going on. First of all, we need to communicate with each other. And when one group is only looking at Fox News and another group is only looking at the New York Times, they're not even seeing the same stories. And so it's important, I think, for people to sort of find out what everybody is looking at so we can have a frame of reference. I mean, the difference in what we're seeing now than 30 years ago is there used to be just a few media outlets and everybody sort of saw or exposed to the same kinds of things so we could talk to each other.
Hmm.
In a niche culture like we live right now, we're living in our own communication worlds, and we need to be able to bust out of that.
Right. I think you mentioned echo chambers earlier. Another term I've heard is filter bubbles. We can set our media and our social media that we only consume things that we filter out everything that just doesn't match our own worldview,
Yes.
and it does happen on both sides of the
And see,
spectrum.
that's the antithesis of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is supposed to expose us and supposed to give us a marketplace of ideas. And if we're only going to the same store every day, we're not seeing what else is out there. We're not getting a depth of the understanding of the kinds of choices we need to be able to make.
Right. No, I'm also wondering if we kind of place this in a global context. So we're talking about the First Amendment in the United States, but do you see the way other nations are handling similar issues? Is it different? Are there other approaches that just kind of don't fit within our system of government?
Well, yeah, they're not something to look at favorably generally because it's
Hmm.
usually censorship and controlling the news that way. I think that there's some experimentation. The British with the BBC have tried to create a neutral news outlet, even if it's government, even if it's in some sense beholden to the government. So I think that's an effort where to try to get outside of the pressures of advertising or things to create news. I once was at a conference where a German law professor said this question I ever heard. It was the Supreme Court justice was there, and he asked the Supreme Court justice, how can you in the United States think you have a free press when it's owned by private enterprise? And think about the implications of just that question.
Hmm.
Is a press that's responding to consumer demand or responding to advertising interest going to give us the kind of objectivity that one might not, was the point that he was trying to make.
Right. I've heard something similar. Somebody compared the great flagship newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, were traditionally owned by private individuals, families, not beholden to the government or companies, just kind of the family's private interest. I guess that's fading away. Although Jeff Bezos, has bought the Washington Post. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or is it
I
neither?
think it's a bad thing that the corporatization of the media, because corporate law means that the responsibility of the directors is to maximize profits. And that may mean cutting news, it might mean cutting investigative reporting. It might mean not having reporters in parts of the world. And we are massive paucity in where our reporters are for our media because of the cost and everything like that. So when the corporation that owns the media is beholden to shareholders' interests, that leads to a different product than when the entity thinks of itself as dedicated to serving the public and dedicated to providing objective news. Yeah, I think it's been a real development.
Right.
And not a good
one. So when you mentioned the BBC, I think I read at some point the reason why Johnson funded the PBS back in the 60s was because he wanted a government channel that he could control. He was sick of looking at the Vietnam news stories on CBS and everything. So, and ironically, PBS and NPR and those kind of things are on the chopping block right now.
I wasn't aware of that story. I mean, I think NPR and have been able to keep an independence that probably President Johnson might not have liked.
Right.
But
right.
But there is always a question of how objective any entity is,
mm-hmm.
which is why variety of entities is a good thing.
Yeah. So, do you think the media can do anything differently to help educate the public about these questions, especially the First Amendment questions and the freedom of speech and freedom of press questions?
Well, yeah, I think we need to talk more about this. I think that the media can raise it. The problem is that if the New York Times runs a story on this, 50% of the public are going to ignore it because it's the New York Times, or if Fox News does something on this, then somebody else is not going to ignore that because it's Fox News. I mean, what we need, I think, the media speaking as a group, coming together to talk about how important these issues are, I think would be something valuable. And the media, frankly, sort of being less partisan would be a little helpful as well. But the problem with that is whether we're going to look at nonpartisan news the way we're looking at the news that reaffirms where we want things to be.
Right, right. Well, great. I think I wrapped up the questions I have for you. Were there things that you feel like people need to know, something I didn't address about fake news and legal matters?
No, I think you did a great job. I was prepared for this thing. So no, I mean, just seeing what the tension is. On the one hand, I mean, the fundamental tension here is on one hand, you have speech coming that is dramatically antithetical to what a democracy needs. A democracy requires an informed electorate. And if the electorate is being filled with false stories and relying on stories that are not true, that damages the electoral process, and it damages the integrity of democracy itself. So you have that on one hand. And on the other hand, you have the entity that could curb that is the government. And having the state step in raises another set of First Amendment issues, which is the question of whether the state can act in a way that's not primarily interested in protecting state prerogatives. Mm-hmm. So these are two very serious concerns, and there's no easy answer because there's no easy right way to solve this.